Hello, and welcome to Leveraging Simulations and Storytelling to Enhance Leadership Development. Thank you for joining us today from your dining room tables or couches. We appreciate you coming to see what we have to talk about. First, I'll start with a few housekeeping tips. If you're listening using your computer's speaker system by default, this is what you'll see. If you prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. Submit as many questions as you would like in the question pane of the control panel, and we will answer them at the end of the session. This session is being recorded, and we will be sharing it with you along with the slides after the webinar. So I'd love to introduce Dr. Wanda T. Wallace. She's one of our presenters. She's managing partner of the Leadership Forum, author of You Can't Know It All, which is a great book that's available where you buy your books. Host of Out of the Comfort Zone podcast, speaker, executive coach, and facilitator. And Stephen Baer, who's co-founder of the game agency and the Training Arcade, monthly contributor to Forbes.com, speaker at EdTech conferences, and former director of marketing at Atari. So here's the agenda for today. Why stories and simulations are great methods for training, what's required to create an effective simulation, how to use this learning strategy in a virtual environment, and how to create trust and establish a safe learning environment. What data and metrics can help you determine the ROI on your training? And I'm going to start with a poll. I will go ahead and launch it, so please answer it when you have a minute. The first question we have is, are you using simulations to train your employees? Either yes or no. Okay, we're starting to get some answers. Okay, I will go ahead and close the poll and share results. So 48% says yes, they're using simulations to train your employees, and 52% no. So almost half and half, which is great. So we definitely have lots to talk about. And I'm going to launch one more poll. Give me 1 second. So the next one is pretty simple. If so, if you are doing simulations for training, which level? Entry, mid, or senior? So please take a minute to select one of those. We'll just give it 1 minute. Okay, we've got some action. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. So it looks like 44% are using it for entry level, 44% for mid-level, and 13% for senior. So that is very interesting. So with that, thank you for engaging in that. With that, I'm going to start with benefits of simulation. So I will pass it on to Stephen Baer, and go ahead.
Super. Well, thank you. And by the way, thank you everyone for participating early on. Just it's always good to have some context as to who's doing simulations, or certainly anything that we're discussing, and also how they're using them. And we have a few more questions, or at least one more question that we'll ask in a little bit. I wanted to start with this slide because I think this is really important. When you think about simulations overall, they absolutely fall into the bottom part of this this image here, this graph. They are an active learning experience. And if you look at this graph overall, and I think probably most people on this webinar have seen this before, think about all the different ways that you can educate someone. And I seem to focus most of my career and most of my efforts on active learning. because active learning really drives much greater retention along the line, along the way. That's what the numbers are down the middle of the path. If you think about passive experiences like lectures or reading or audio, visual, or demonstration, they're going to have a relatively small amount of retention after that learning experience. Versus discussions where you're actually engaging with the material, or practice, which simulations fall into that category, or actually teaching with a G that information yourself is going to require you to really engage with the material on a much deeper level. And so I think that's really important. On the right-hand side, we have a different chart, which I'm going to pass over to Wanda to talk about, but I think that they really speak to each other very much so.
Okay. Well, the right-hand chart, the 70%, 20%, 10%, I imagine most of you've seen somewhere before. And this comes from going to executives and asking them what was most useful for you in preparing for your next level of job. And most 70% of executives say that they learned the most for preparation on the job. 20% from feedback and coaching and mentors, by the way, and then 10% from formal learning. And that's kind of consistent with the passive and active. Though I think both of these are a teeny bit simplistic, because I think that 10% formal learning, if used in a really good way, helps make sense of the 70 and 20 that you've gotten in other places. So I would argue that there is a small place, even for lectures or reading, but left alone on its own without some integration into some more active learning, we're missing the mark. So Steve, back to you.
Yeah, I would agree, and I don't think that there's a one solution fits all, but I think the takeaway in my mind is whether you're learning on the job or you're learning in an active learning experience in the classroom, being able to really apply what you're learning real time to the topic at hand is critical. And what actually really excites me, probably more than anything else that we're going to be talking about during this webinar, is most of the work that we do at the Training Arcade and the game agency is often a single player experience. When we worked with Wanda, which is one of the case studies we'll be talking about today, it was about classroom engagement, people working together and really digging into the material and doing peer-to-peer conversations. So we'll get there, but I think that that's really important when you think about what that simulation experience is. Is it 100% on your own, or is it in collaboration with others? So we'll talk about that as well. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. One second. Okay, so the other thing that we talk about a lot at the game agency is storytelling. And when it comes to a simulation, storytelling is absolutely critical for several reasons. First of all, it further engages the person, the learner, with the content, right? It makes it certainly much more emotional, makes it much more memorable, and it gives them lots of things that they can relate to, whether it is scenarios or settings or characters or challenges. It's things that they can say, gosh, I've experienced this in my work environment, and having played through this scenario here, I can understand how I can apply maybe myself in a different way back in the office tomorrow. So I love storytelling. I think it's absolutely critical, and I think that when it comes to really anything we're building at the game agency, a good game or a good simulation has to have a really strong story arc attached to it. Wanda, I think we were talking about this earlier. I know you've done a lot of research on this topic, so I would love to hear your thoughts as well.
My original academic research, heaven forbid, is actually in this area. So let me not bore you with that one, but let me just sort of say first a personal story. Whether I like it or not, across all of my years of work with leaders in every training and development, what people remember afterwards is the story I told, not the brilliant insight that I tried to offer in any particular occasion. It's the story. I think as human beings, we are hardwired to remember stories. And as Annette Simon says, that is our survival mechanism. It's what gives us our sense of identity, and it tells us what is going to help us survive or not survive. And if it's that strong evolutionarily, then it's really important in terms of developing leaders. And I think, in fact, I think that's why mentorship works so well. It's basically an exchange of stories. People are telling stories about what they've done and how they've done. And I think that's why that feedback and coaching piece carries 20% of it. So the last thing I want to say, though, is I don't think we use them nearly actively enough in our training and development. We don't think about the story, the arc of the story, the implications of the story, the discussion about the story beyond anything other than case studies. And I just think this methodology gives us a whole new level to take it to.
I would agree. And Jen teased you with that next slide, and I think it actually
Sorry.
transitions really well. If you look at Google, a company that probably most of you are familiar with, they say that 7 out of the 8 most important hiring skills for them are soft skill related. And if you think about stories, stories are all wrapped around soft skills, right? It's about how we interact with people, how we feel emotionally about situations, how we act and behave based on different scenarios that we're in. So these skills are only improved and really worked on through a story-driven learning experience. And so I believe that ultimately simulations are the best tool to address that in the long run. And we're going to talk about a bunch of examples along this way. Okay. So we're going to get into some examples shortly, but I wanted to just go through this slide, which I know it's an eye chart, but I think it's a really important slide to be thinking about. These are 6 considerations that we talk about a lot, that if you ultimately can check off all these, that you really give some thought to each one of these as you're building a simulation, I think your ultimate deliverable is going to be so much stronger. So I'm going to go one by one, and Wanda, I encourage you to please jump in as well. So the first one is on the top left corner, and that is branches. So when you're building out a scenario, you can go multiple paths. We always talk about branching dialogues or branching scenarios, ultimately representing the situation that a player or players are in, and the decisions they make are going to take you down one branch or another, right? As a designer, you can make these branches as complicated as you want, but I am a firm believer that that is a horrible experience for an instructional designer and often not such a good experience for the learner, right? So I have 2 little charts here. I have one that shows on its way to becoming a potentially very complicated branch. And the one below it is the one that I actually prefer, right? It's about giving choices to the learner, letting them see the different directions they can go, letting them see the repercussions of their decisions, but ultimately bringing them back to a path that is going to be the way that you want them to learn, right? You want them to see something. Now, it's not a linear experience, but it's important to think about if I can give them options, but I can ultimately direct them. I think that's the best case scenario. No pun intended. Okay, the second one is relevant choices. So when you're thinking about the choices that you're going to give someone to make, you want to make sure that they feel authentic, feel relevant, right? It is, what type of thing might you say to somebody, or what type of decision might you make? The one on the right-hand side, which you probably can't see, but it says throw coffee at your computer, it's probably not a relevant choice, right? It's probably not something you're going to do. You want to make sure that, and I believe this when any type of game or any type of scenario, you want it to feel like it is not tongue-in-cheek. You want to make it feel like it is a relevant or realistic choice that you can make and have someone choose, hopefully, the optimal one. Okay. The third option, or the third topic I want to talk about is choices, the number of choices. So a lot of us are at home with our families right now, given this pandemic, and I spend almost every night with my family just as a form of relaxation. Oh, do you mind jumping back, Jen?
Yep, sorry.
That's okay. I spend almost every night with my family just relaxing and watching something on Netflix, right? But what's interesting is that almost it's a ritual. We spend almost more time trying to decide what to watch than we actually spend watching it because there are so many choices. And I think it is critical, whether it's in that environment or it's in this environment that we're talking about, a learning environment, that you reduce the number of choices to make sure that it feels like a manageable number, right? As we think about any scenario or any simulation that we would go through, we're going to have an X number of choices that we can make that would feel relevant, that would feel realistic, and keep it to those, right? Because that's enough to have a manageable branch and certainly a very valuable lesson learned. The fourth category, voice. I think that voice is really critical on 2 fronts. First one is to be thinking about as a subject matter expert, what are the critical points that you need to be making, right? So whether it is technical points or it is the tone, you want to make sure that you've made the right points. But also, I think it's the voice. It's the tone of the voice, right? It's about thinking about how would this stakeholder say something to me, right? And you want to feel, once again, relevant, realistic. So it's not just about what the choices are that you can make, but it's also what are the things that someone might say to you. So I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but I think that these are all important things to be thinking about as you're building out a simulation. Two more. Next one is useful feedback. So this image where it says wrong in big letters, that is, in my opinion, the wrong way to do it, right? I don't think that wrong is useful feedback. What I think is useful feedback in a simulation is seeing the repercussions of your decision. So if I say something to Wanda, because Wanda happens to be the character in the simulation I'm playing, she's going to respond to me one way or another. She's going to say, Stephen, that's a great point you made, or Stephen, I actually disagree with you this, but she won't say wrong, right? You want it to feel like it's useful information that's going to alter the way you're going to act and alter the decisions you're going to make in that simulation. Last point I want to make is about visuals. There are 1,000 ways you can do visuals in your simulations. We're going to talk about a few of them. The one, and once again, I'm looking at the 4 images on the bottom right-hand corner. The one on the top left of those is from the first example we're going to talk about. It is a simulation that Wanda recently worked on with us. And what's really interesting is if you look at the faces, and you'll see some more art shortly, all the faces are not incredibly defined with features that are going to make you think about a particular culture or potentially a particular age. I think in some ways that's really important. Thinking about the situation and not about the person per se, right? And not thinking about the culture, not making predefined decisions. You may want to focus on the culture. You may want to focus on the individual in a deeper way, right? So you might want to use video. You might want to do illustrations that are more lifelike. You might want to do animations that are going to show you certain things. I think it's really identifying what the topic is, who the audience is, and what you want to convey. And I think that the visuals have to speak to those priorities. So that was a mouthful. Wanda, yeah.
I just want to add, I think these 6 are really important because these are the ones that are going to let your audience say, that's realistic, that fits me, that's a credible story. And mix any one of these, like too simplistic of branches, and people are going to say, yeah, but that wouldn't happen here. Or insufficient choices, they're going to say, yeah, that was too easy. But it's the 6 in combination that leave people feeling, this is a story I can relate to. It fits me. And that's where we get the engagement, the memory, the credibility, the learning, and everything with it.
Couldn't agree more. Great. Okay, so let's, enough theory. Let's get into some real examples. And we have a few that we're going to talk about. And I really want to pass this over to Wanda for the most part. This first example is one that really was run by the Leadership Forum, really just using our technology, the training arcade. It is called World of Sabrina, and I'm going to ask Wanda to talk about it. In particular, I'm going to ask Wanda that she focus a little bit on EQ and IQ, because I know that was a big priority in the design, and I think that will be interesting for people on this webinar.
Okay, let me see if I can give you a quick tour through what this thing is about. It was designed for women in the organization, and it turns out women and men in the organization who are at the early mid-career stages and who will be facing some career challenges. And the intent is to get them more prepared for the cases, the challenges that they're going to face before they actually have them. So they're much more smart about the choices they make. EQ smart and IQ smart. That's also a way to let them see why mentorships or strong networks or EQ understanding really become effective for the scenarios that happen. And that's what this is about. So just for a basic introduction, we have at the very beginning, you see the top left graphic, we have 13 choices, things you could do in your career, ways in which you could invest marginal time, take a class, get a mentor, those sorts of normal things that happen. And there's where you get your choice set, Steve. And then things happen, scenarios happen. pieces of the story for Sabrina of here's this chapter, here's what happened to her. And then you get choices, usually 3, sometimes 5, but it depends. And each choice has consequences. No choice is perfect in and of itself. Each choice is perfectly viable under some conditions. And what we're trying to get people to do is to debate, when is that choice the right choice or a better choice? And what are the consequences of making that choice? And can I manage that choice? So we're getting them to think. And there you get the IQ and the EQ. What's the impact on my stakeholders as well as the impact on my business? And that's where the two start to come together. What I think is unique for most simulations and what we've done here is that we've done a blended approach. And I don't mean distance and classroom blended. I mean blended in terms of methodology. So you've got a simulation which really carries the story. That is the story of Sabrina and what happens to her, and just plausible things, all of which are real events that have happened for clients. And then I believe, because I've seen it so frequently, that when groups get together and can debate the choices and the consequences, they have a very rich conversation. They see things in a slightly different way because they're coming at it from different perspectives. And that's where the boost in confidence really comes from. Because if you didn't know the answer to this and I didn't know the answer for it, well, I'm not in such a bad shape after all. This is where I am in my career. I get it. Let me ask for help. So that group dynamic. But I also happen to believe that if we just let groups early in their career carry on having conversations and debating choices, they'll make the same old mistakes that they've always made. So it's a blind alley. So I want just enough instructor input to make sure that they are seeing the right kind of implications for it and thinking about the right series of questions. Not that we want to give them an answer, because I don't think there is an answer. I think it's a thinking process, a discovery process, if you will. And that's what we've tried to do here. The last thing I want to say is just to echo the piece that Steve said earlier about the graphics. We intentionally chose a very sparse graphical selection because I didn't want it to have a nationality. I didn't want it to have a particular voice. It's text only for exactly that reason. I didn't want a particular ethnicity. We were trying not to be particularly white or black or Asian or brown or pick any other thing in there that you can think of. Now, that's never perfect because everybody will look at the characters and say, oh, I think that's X or Y. But the intent was to be as neutral as we could be, giving just enough visual, but really to emphasize the story itself as the engaging factors, not the graphics. So Steve,
Wanda,
did I answer your question about
yeah,
EQ?
no, that's perfect. I do actually have a few more questions, things that I just find interesting about this case study. So, and I don't know how much you can say based off of what's confidential or not. So, I know that you've now worked with a few different industries using this this one simulation you've built out. And I don't know if you can talk about the different industries, but I also know that if I understand correctly, it started really as focusing on women, and it then became something that became, as I think you alluded to, something that was equally relevant for conversation with not just women in the room, but both genders. And so I was hoping you can talk about how you flexed it accordingly with that. The last thing I just want to add in is what I love about what you guys did here, and this is something that we added to the the training arcade based off of this execution, was the multimeter, right? So I think that there are a lot of simulations that look at, hey, am I advancing sufficiently, or am I hitting a toggle of this better than this? What you guys have done, which is really hard to see in this image, but is you said, all right, let's identify what some of your top priorities are, and let's see if all your decisions are mapping to those. So I was hoping you could talk a little about that and the first two questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so let me do the last one first. You can barely see it in the top left graph, and you'll see some little green bits there. And what we did was create 5 gauges, and we said there are 5 things that you have got to manage if you're going to progress your career, and that was the whole point of this one. One is you have to manage your time, and by time we mean your marginal time. There's a limited supply of it. You can't do everything, so how are you doing it? And then we want to make sure that your work is having the right impact, and we wanted to make sure your stakeholders are in the right place, that you're managing those effectively, and we want to make sure that you are seen as ready for the next step. And then the last one is you have to have business impact, because if you're not having business impact, then what's the point? So you see constantly throughout this, how am I doing against those 5 gauges? And that's your metric for your progress, and it's also your metric for how you're competing with other teams and who has a better answer or a worse answer or whatever. It's the combination of those trade-offs, in effect. So, and then you ask about, we did design this one intentionally for women, and we were immediately getting from our clients, which are across industry. There are quite a few of them. So professional services, financial services, and some more standard kind of providers as well. Standard industries as well. We were getting questions about, what about men? Can we do training for men? So we've run this with mixed groups of men and women, just as all of them are encountering Sabrina. And I have to tell you, it's the same outcome at the end of the day. It's an interesting debate about why people would choose A or B. It's the same scenarios that men encounter as well as women encounter. And I think there's a lovely leveling effect in that discussion. You didn't ask, Steve, but I will say the 3 components that I think make this one so well, the group discussion, the story component, and the instructor input, is not required that we're all face-to-face. That leads itself to be done either in a session together or virtually as well.
That's great. That's great. And I definitely want to talk about shortly, as we're moving to a virtual world, or at least currently are in a virtual world, or a hyper virtual world, that in much more detail. Wanda, one of the people, Kevin, asks to explain the difference between simulations and scenarios. So I have a point of view on that. If you do, I'd love to hear yours first. Otherwise, I'm happy to jump in.
So scenarios in the typical sense of training means that we have a future scenario of what the world might look like, 3 years, 6 months, 5 years from now. And we try to imagine what it is to live in that scenario and make some decisions and understand and look backwards and say, well, given that world, what does that mean we need to be doing now to prepare? And it is a fabulous way to think about complexity and think about uncertainty and the unknowns and ambiguity. I do use the word scenario, but what I mean here is it's a situation. It's basically an event in a career life that we have to deal with. And the events are things, just so you get a record, or somebody asks you to do an extracurricular activity, do you say yes or no? Somebody suggests that maybe you should cancel a vacation, do you or don't you? Somebody takes credit for your work. You need to persuade people over whom you have no authority to get something done and they're not delivering. What do you do? It's those kind of classic career scenarios that everybody has to manage. So you should think of the word much more as scenes, not in the classic scenario planning kind of sense.
I would agree with that, and I would just say that to round it out, the simulation in my mind is the framework in which different scenarios may fall, right? In my mind, I think of simulation as a type of game or a type of learning experience, right? And it's going to have, in this case, many scenarios in there that you have to navigate as the learner or as the player. Okay. Let's keep going. So the next slide, wanted to talk about, Sabrina, I think, is a great example because it's, in my mind, it has many use cases. And on the left-hand side here, you see a number of other, or 2 other, examples of simulations that are also illustrated, that are story-driven. The first one's illustrated. The second one is video-oriented, both focusing on soft skills. So the one on the top left-hand corner is focused on educating healthcare professionals about diagnosing key therapeutic or making key therapeutic diagnoses based on the patient's symptoms and really having those conversations and understanding that. The one on the bottom left also happens to be in the healthcare space, and it's about having very difficult conversation with patients, specifically in the HIV category, and guiding them into care after they've been diagnosed. And those are hard conversations. Once again, very much about soft skills, having very difficult conversations and making sure that you're able to guide that conversation down the right path to either understand a situation better or to influence a decision that someone's going to make more effectively. And I think those are important. And I think you can do them with video. I think you can do them with illustrations. I think at the end of the day, you have to understand who your audience is and what's going to be most applicable for that content and what you're trying to articulate. The two to the right one, I'm going to ask you to talk about as well, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think my entire professional life has been about how to drag practice and practical advice into whatever training and development we're doing, wherever, however that happens. And so I want to talk about two that are not typical formats of a classic gaming simulation, if you will, though they could be. And one is one that I'm particularly fond of. Many of you will have seen using actors in some sort of session, but typically actors come in to act out a pre-scripted scenario. And I don't like using that. I like having actors come in to be a character in a scene, in an event, and having people in the session react in real time to that actor, to that character, and to that face that you see in front of you. Now, we can do that a bit with video, but you still miss that visceral response of, oh my gosh, they just said, now what am I supposed to do? And I just think they're valuable for being able to navigate some of the difficult conversations, kind of exactly as you just said, Steve. A final one that you probably don't think about in terms of a simulation, but could just as easily be a simulation, and that's using an assessment, whether it's a 360 assessment or self-assessment. It's a way of helping you understand where you sit on a set of skills versus someone else. And the discussions, the exercises, the practice that comes out of that representation, the comparison, can be just as insightful as any number of other things. One day I'm actually going to build, Steve, a simulation in which we do an assessment, and that's your branching strategy that takes you then right straight to the pieces that you need to work harder on. Coming up next.
I love that. I love that. And I do actually think, we talk about this actually a lot over at the game agency, is that, you know, many games are used for the purposes of understanding what do people know, while simulations, I think, really focus mostly on how do people behave, right? And I think that's a really important distinction, in understanding behavioral trends and identifying persona types and identifying how someone can hone in on particular skills and where they best belong in an organization. These soft skills and these soft categories, I think, are critical. And I think simulations and scenarios within simulations are really fantastic at identifying some of that key information. So, okay, let's move on. I do want to do one more poll question. This, you know, it really specifically focuses on the fact that we are all living in a very virtual world right now since March, right? And I would love to understand, for those of you who are doing simulations or are thinking about doing simulations, you know, a little bit more about your plans, you know, for remote workers. Are you more or less likely I should say, are you more likely to do simulations while your employees are working remote? Jen, I can't see the back end, so if you whenever you think it's most appropriate, if you
yeah, they're answering. So
perfect.
Interesting response. All right, I'll go ahead and close it and share results. So the results are 70% yes, 13% no, and 17% are not sure.
That's great to hear. I do believe that whether you are doing these simulations as a individual user experience or potentially, and I really have become a big advocate of it since the World of Sabina came out, as a group activity, I think that certainly engaging remote workers with one another in scenarios like this are critical. If we can jump back to the slides, Jen, I want to introduce Carlos Vargas, and Carlos has been. I've known Carlos for 20 years, and Carlos is over at Advantage Performance Group and has been focusing on this for the vast majority of his career: simulations, in classroom training, storytelling. And I wanted to ask him to join us just as another point of view. He's been quietly listening, and I'm sure he has many thoughts on this topic. As you're seeing a transition from a simply in classroom experience to a mostly digital experience, I know that you do both, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on what trends you're seeing there and how you're planning in your own world and what you're seeing of others and your colleagues doing to transition simulations into a virtual experience.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Stephen. And by the way, I'm really happy to see the world of Sabrina work so well done, so well completed. It really demonstrates, the power of what can be done when you have a combination of amazing subject matter expertise and a very good and solid technology. So anyway, yeah, like Stephen said, I had the privilege, I think, of working with some of the best simulation-based training organizations, and that comes back to about 20 years. So we would get in front of people and deliver training initiatives mostly for senior executives, and we would be in front of the audience, right? So it's been great to see the evolution of this type of learning and how new players are coming in, especially like the training arcade, where they really, I think, Stephen, what you guys have put together really combines what you need to be able to migrate, to mutate something that is live, that works in a live setting, and then move it into a virtual environment. And I say that because of some of the things that you've been sharing with me. It comes down to three things that I think they are so important, right? The first one is the simplicity. If you have a chance to have access to the platform, it doesn't require a lot of technical knowledge to be able to upload, design a simulation experience, a good one, on the platform, right? And you need to have that to be able to make changes and mutate, change something to live to remote. So that's one, the simplicity. The second one is the scalability. So how fast can you be able to make something simple and multiply, making available 2,000 participants at the same time, right? And that's so important, even if you're going to be working and delivering a conference, or to be in a virtual environment with thousands of people. So that's key. And the third one is, that rapid development process. I think back in the day, you would take 1 or 2 weeks to validate changes with client, get things done. Now, with what you guys have put together, it really comes down to maybe a few hours, 2 or less, to update something. So that's in terms of being able to migrate something that has been working face-to-face to work remote. Now, you have something about trust, and I wanted to address that topic because it's really one of the toughest challenge when we talk about delivering content using simulation technologies, right? I think it comes down to, when I was thinking about this question that you were going to ask me before, it comes down to some of the key drivers of trust, right? And the first one is when you are in a live situation, face-to-face environment, you can work on the empathy, right? And you can do that very easily. When you're doing something remotely, you probably have to work before that session to know in advance, know your participant, right? So you can create that connection. That's a little, it's extra work that you have to put on the instructor, but it's available because you know who's going to be there, you know the type of audience who's going to be present, so then you can anticipate to what's going to happen. That empathy. The second one, it comes down to the design concept you guys were talking about. I think I would put that with the word authenticity and relevance, right? So it is different to have a number of people in an audience and clarify a question in about a couple of minutes, right? And get to the discover learning portion of a simulation. But in a remote environment, you have to use, you don't have a day anymore, you have 2-3 hours, right? So to capture the attention and being authentical, being relevant, that's so key. And that comes back to that concept of simplicity on your platform. And I think the last thing, it goes back to the logic, right? I think I talked about empathy, authenticity, and then the logic. And when I say logic, it's more about the type of content you're putting out there, right? One that has years of research-based publication, right? That provides automatic credibility for anyone that is going to be in front of the audience delivering the content, because the credibility of someone who has worked on that subject, who has the stories, is there.
Those are all great points. That's great points. And I actually particularly like where you went with the trust. Well, actually, I particularly like where you went with our platform, but but I think that the question about trust and establishing the type of learning environment that it's going to feel valuable to people in a remote setting, in a quite honestly a very distracting setting, is really critical. And so, Wanda, I know you also have some points of view on that. I would love it if you could jump into there as well.
Yeah, I think this is where simulation is actually the key to bring people in, because it's so engaging. It's the story. It's going to grab your attention. If we get that content right, as Carlos says, and as you said at the beginning with the qualities, I think that's the instantaneous pull. And I think that's important. But I'm finding, surprising to me, that creating trust in a virtual learning environment has become easier than I would have expected it to be, even in a face-to-face classroom. And it's partly because I think we're all feeling, our masks are down a little bit. You see my home behind me, I see your home behind, I mean, my authentic part is a little bit more visible already to anybody who's on a webinar or a training session. And I think this takes a layer down. And we don't have on our usual uniform, like we're more just people being there. I think that helps. And I've also seen that starting a training session with a really good question, beyond the where do you work and what do you do for fun questions, but a question like, what's one skill you would really love to wake up tomorrow and have and don't have, and why, is an easy one for people to answer. But all of a sudden you're disclosing a lot more, and you can get to that trust in this current environment in some ways easier than we could have ever done in the face-to-face. We have to set it up and structure it that way, though, to make it effective. And one last thing I want to say, I think one of the important parts about the virtual environment, about the learning environment in general, is creating that peer-to-peer discussion. We've already mentioned that. I believe it strongly. But I have to make sure those peer-to-peer discussions continue. And that's an important part to consider as you're doing this virtual. What happens after this virtual event that keeps those connections alive, I think is an important part.
So I want to address the question that Patricia asked, and actually I want to come back to the last part you just said, Wanda, at the tail end of my addressing it. Patricia asks, as T&D budgets get cut, what resources, websites, research, etc., are available to create interactive training internally with no money? And I think that there are some answers to that. It's a hard question to answer, right? Because I think that if I were to say, what can you do with no or very limited money, the very first thing I think I would point you to are, in my opinion, there are thousands of great Harvard Business School case studies. When I went to business school, I studied tons of them, and quite honestly, those are the stories, going back to the beginning of this webinar, that still stick in my mind, 20 years later, right? So, now they're not free, but they're, $15. So yes, in my opinion, that probably still falls into your category of no money. And I think that some of those are great frameworks for excellent scenarios and discussions. But I think that only addresses part of your question, right? Because what I read in your question is to create interactive training, right? So I think that part of it is the story, but I think the other part is the user experience, the user journey, the learner journey. And in my mind, there are two parts to that learning journey. I think there is the classroom part, right, which is how are we going to go down this scenario together, and how are we going to make key decisions together, and how are we going to see what the repercussions of those decisions are. And some of that is qualitative and some of that's quantitative, right? And if you're just, on a Zoom, talking about a, particular case study, there's nothing you can point to very easily, with the exception, actually, you can point to quick surveys and say, hey, let's look at this and see that, 38% of us would go this way, right? So I think that's helpful, but it's maybe not quite, it doesn't give you the full picture. But that is certainly the very small budget approach you could take to it. There are other tools, and I'll give a few. The one that we're talking about a lot today is called the Training Arcade. It's relatively inexpensive, and happy to answer any questions about it at another point. There's other tools out there. There's a tool called Branch Track, which is more expensive, but also a branching path platform to look at. And then, all the major rapid authoring tools, Captivate, Storyline, Lectora, they have tools to do that. The difference is, and this goes back to what Carlos was saying, is you can build a branch with the Training Arcade in an hour or two if you have your content. It's going to take 30 to 90 hours in those platforms. So I don't know if that quite answers your question, but there are a lot of tools out there. Some of them are relatively inexpensive, and hopefully that's at least a good starting point. And Wanda, I assume you have some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, there are hundreds of podcasts. I have one, so I'll just, out of the comfort zone, look for it, go listen to it. There are hundreds of those out there that are really, really good, and they are free. The problem is that none of the people in your organization have the time to curate that content. So curating it for them, so that's using your time and legwork to create that bite, that snippet, that 10-minute segment, and then imagine how to structure a conversation around that podcast. So let's say there's a 20, 30-minute segment, maximum, people listen to it. There might be an article attached to it, an exercise attached to it. And then we've got a discussion group, not unlike a book club discussion group. That is readily available, easy to do if you put the time in. And if you add tools like the Training Arcade, I think you get brilliant quickly.
The other thing that I wanted to go back to, and I forgot to mention this, and this goes back to what Wanda was saying earlier, is that learning journey, right? There's one thing to be in a webinar or in a classroom, but as strong as the story is, I think that when we get back to our day-to-day business, hopefully some of it will resonate and stick with us. But without continuing that learning journey, it's gonna leave faster than you want, right? So I do believe that having ongoing exercises or check-ins or scenarios that you can roll out as part of your training to keep the topic and the learning alive is critical. And quite honestly, you can build it and deliver it in for the most part as some pre-work, in classroom or in virtual classroom work, and post work. And I think being able to tell that elongated story and keeping it alive is really critical. Tyler asks, do you have to be an instructional designer? So I do not believe you have to be an instructional designer. I am not an instructional designer. I am a storyteller. I am a creative. I'm a marketing guy. And I am someone who kind of fumbled my way, about 18 years ago into the video game space, and then into the learning game space, and to the simulation game space. And quite honestly, I think if you can tell a good story and you can help someone go down a particular path by understanding the way that their behaviors result in certain actions, I think that that's great. And I think that instructional design, while it's a nice skill to have to round out your ability to build a nice simulation, is important, I don't think it's critical by any sense. That's my take, Wanda. I don't know if you or Carlos, if you would agree or disagree.
Yeah,
I agree.
On this, Tyler, you do not need to be instructional designer. I think that a lot of us over the years have developed skill that is actually required for most work, which is to create a presentation, right? So when you're creating a presentation, you're making sure that you're communicating some points across, right? So I think that more than having instructional design work, you have to be able to, start with the end in mind. What is the learning that the participant wants to have? And then from there, work backwards to create, in this case, scenarios that will drive that journey from the learner to make decisions and get some learnings as a result of making decisions. So no, you don't have to. I would recommend that if it is your first experience doing this, definitely, you work with a team of people who provide content, and you actually have, somehow input from a design perspective, uh, just to make sure that it's going to be agnostic enough so people are going to like it. I don't know. That's just my 5 cents.
I would agree with that. I'm going to answer one more question I see, and then I want to jump to the next slide. Katie asked, can the training arcade be used with Storyline 360? The answer is yes. And we have a lot of documentation on certainly how it plugs in seamlessly to all the major authoring tools. But yes, the answer is yes. And we see a lot of people doing that. I'd like to jump to the last slide, and certainly, please, if there are more questions, please keep asking. But in my mind, this slide should have said 5 simulation design takeaways, but it says 4. But it's 4 plus the 5th one's really important. Okay, so if I gave a checklist earlier of things that you want to think about as you're building a simulation, and I think that if you have 4 or 5 key takeaways, what should they be from this webinar? So 1, I think a successful simulation ultimately is a very immersive experience, right? You want someone to be in there and feel like they're in another space. You don't want them to be distracted by everything that's around them, the people or the distractions that are happening. You want them to feel like they can get in and they can navigate and they feel like they're in a world that they can relate to, right? I think that's really important. Number 2, peer-centric. And this has been my big learning as a professional over the last 6 months of working with Wanda on the world of Sabrina. It's quite valuable if you can build a simulation that's not just about a single player experience, but it's about building peer-to-peer discussions, having people talk to one another and understand the repercussions together of the decisions they make in that virtual world and how it impact them in the real world. Number 3, applicability. Give learners something that's relevant, but equally important, give someone that's something that's bite-sized. We live in such a micro content world that's important. You want them to be able to come in, feel like they can relate to it, like it's relevant, like it's digestible, and you want them to be able to take away something that's tangible, something that they can apply in their everyday world tomorrow or the next hour. Action-oriented. This relates absolutely to that, right? You want them to have something that a tool set, a particular skill that they walk away and say, gosh, I can apply that tomorrow, and I realize that I haven't been doing that for the last 10 years. So I think that's really important. Make it action-oriented. The last one is, and it's funny, we were going through this last night, it's not just about making sure that you can check up all these things, but make sure it's a fun experience, right? At the end of the day, simulations and games really stick out because they should be something that someone says, that was cool. That was a fun experience. That's something I can take and actually apply to my day-to-day business, not something I dread having to read or having to watch, or a video from the 1970s that my company's been using for 40 years now, right? So at the end of the day, you want it to be a good, fun experience that feels digestible, immersive, and applicable. And if you've hit all those, then you've hit a grand slam. Wanda, Carlos, do you have anything you want to add to that, or? No? Okay.
Oh.
I've kept them silent. I've made them silent. Okay. Okay. So Eric wants to know, how can he work with the Leadership Forum? Wanda, you mind talking about that a little bit?
www.leadership-forum.com. Get in touch. We do a whole range of stuff. It depends upon what you want and what you're looking for, but we do coaching and training and simulations and speaking and webinars and, you name it. Be in touch with us. Happy to talk to you.
Super. If we just advance the next slides, also, this will be in the handout. All of our contact information is there. If you have any questions or are looking for any more information, please don't hesitate. We'd love to, continue this dialogue and hopefully less of a monologue and more of a dialogue. We'd love to work with you and certainly be helpful if we can, whether it's actually jumping and rolling our sleeves together or just directing you to some other resources out there that we're familiar with. We're all happy to do that. Jen, any other questions that you see popping up?
No, I think that's it.
Okay, well, we'll give you guys 4 minutes back, on this app. Hopefully this was a useful time for everybody, and we really appreciate you joining us, and would love to continue the conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank
Okay,
you.
thanks everybody.
Thank you for coming. Thanks.
Take care.